First off, just let me thank everyone for coming in today. Just to set the record straight, this is not a stated. We're not taking minutes. This isn't even a business meeting. We'll follow the Grand Lodges. This is a social get-together just for us to connect again. It's been a while, several months since we've seen each other. And I know Chris has been wanting to provide this program to us, so it's not tiled. We'll have him read his program to us, and we'll have whatever conversations we'd like to have, and we'll go from there. I did speak with Keith Heinerman. He was not able to come on today, but he was concerned a little bit about some of the email traffic going back and forth, calling this a stated meeting. So I just wanted to make sure that we set the record straight and that my district deputy doesn't have any questions for me before we get started.
No, brother, I just appreciate the opportunity and really glad that Virginia Research is taking the opportunity to present a paper and bring the brothers together as best we can under these circumstances. So thanks for the opportunity and thanks for setting it up, and looking forward to hearing Brother Chris today.
Does anyone have any questions for me before I turn it over to Brother Chris? Hearing none. Chris, are you ready, brother?
I am ready. I just want to give everybody an opportunity to say whatever they wanted to say before I dive into the paper. So I'm glad to see more of you all here. I will do whatever you all let me get away with, as you may have noticed. I'm an IT guy by trade, so this is new technology, so it's a toy for me to play with. So I'm going to do this as long as y'all let me. But I think we're going to keep having informal meetings as often as people are interested and present papers. Last week we had a really good presentation from Brother Philippe and two other brothers from Brazil, and they gave us we just had a nice Q&A session about Brazilian Masonry, and I just asked them questions and they all responded and had a lot of good insight and explained the differences, and it was a lot of fun. The cool thing about this research weekly email, I've got over 600 people now that signed up for it. So it's pretty cool. But I got people in literally every continent right now. And I'm going to take advantage of that and try to get some of them to come on and give a talk like we did, talk about Australian Masonry and talk about Romania and Bulgaria and some of these other countries. And I think it'd be really cool to get some insights on that. And that's, to me, as interesting as having an actual paper, is just doing some Q&A like that. So we'll change it up. And if anybody wants to present a paper at one of these online meetings, we'll do that. Just a little backstory. I was asked by Dennis in March or April of last year to write a paper to give at August during his year. And I wrote it. And then I had to sit on it because I promised to give it in Research Lodge, and I didn't feel right giving anywhere else first. So I've sat on it for a year, but in the meantime, I've written another paper related to it that I do go around and give. So it's inspired me, and I'm going to write more papers because I find this stuff fascinating about how Grand Lodges operate and they interact and all the different rites in Masonry. So I'll probably get a whole series of papers out of this one idea. But I was going to give a talk on all the Grand Lodges and Supreme Councils in the world. And I quickly found out that there's a Supreme Council in every country, which surprised me. I thought there was only a few of us. And I realized a paper that was nothing but listing all the Grand Lodges and Supreme Councils would be really boring. It'd be like listing famous Masons. After the first 10 or so, you just sort of tune it out because all you're doing is hearing names, and it's not an entertaining paper. So I decided to focus just in on France because France has over a dozen Grand Lodges and Grand Orients and Supreme Councils operating within it. So that's the topic of my paper today. Alrighty then, with no further delay. The diverse Grand Lodges of France. We know that a lodge is a certain number of Masons gathered together with a charter or warrant from some Grand Lodge empowering them to work. Most of you, like me, would assume that there is only one Grand Lodge for a given jurisdiction. Setting aside our Prince Hall duality for the United States, we will naturally conclude that every country in the world would have a single Grand Lodge over all the lodges in that country. This is not the case, especially in France, which has 24 Grand Lodges and Supreme Councils currently claiming authority. Freemasonry is often said to consist of two branches that are not in mutual regular amity. The first are the Anglo-American regular tradition of Grand Lodges, typified by the United Grand Lodge of England, UGLE. While the second are Grand Orients, the European or continental tradition with varying and shifting amity. This is a list of all of the Grand Lodges and Supreme Councils that are currently operating in France. The first column are all of the Grand Lodges and a few Supreme Councils, major ones being the Grand Orient, Supreme Council of France, Grand College of Rights, Le Droit Humain, and so on. And we'll delve into each one of these as we go through the timeline. The second list are all of the so-called Supreme Councils that claim to operate as Supreme Councils, and they have ties to one or more of the Grand Lodges. So you can see there's a lot going on. I want to draw your attention to the term REAA, which is Right, Ancient, and Accepted. That is the French version of Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite. So when you see REAA, that refers to a Scottish Rite body. So here are the major Grand Lodges and Supreme Councils that we're going to be talking about today. The Grand Orient of France, GODF, it broke away from the Grand Lodge of France, a body which no longer exists. So the Grand Orient may lay claim to being the oldest continuous Grand Lodge in that country. Indeed, they place their actual origin date as 1728, not 1773 when they were constituted. They are well known as the cornerstone of continental Masonry. They lay claim, though not undisputed, to playing a major role in the First French Revolution. The Second French Revolution advanced the concept of secularism, which the Grand Orient adopted wholeheartedly, unlike the Supreme Council. This led to the decision to strike the requirement of belief in one God altogether, which led to the Great Schism with the Grand Lodge of England. To this day, the Grand Orient is considered irregular by most, if not all, American Grand Lodges. The Grand Orient does not shy away from involving itself deeply into politics either. They played a major role in establishing the left-wing Radical Republican Party in 1901 and support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are vocal supporters on the separation of church and state, as well as same-sex marriage. Obviously, they have no restrictions on discussion of politics or religion during their meetings, and we can certainly imagine how those discussions would lean. The Grand Orient has close ties over the centuries with several Supreme Councils, but their lodges are permitted to confer degrees in multiple rites, such as the French Rite, the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, the Rectified Scottish Rite, the Rite of Memphis Misraim, and others. The Grand Lodge of France, GLDF, also lays claim to being the unbroken continuation of the original and also regular French Masonry. Formed out of the Supreme Council of France in 1821 as the Central Grand Lodge to govern the first 3 degrees, they broke away from the Supreme Council in 1894 and took on the current name. They preserved the tradition of requiring belief in a supreme being. They confer the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite degrees in their Blue Lodges. They managed to maintain recognition of Grand Lodges in continental Freemasonry, but avoid the adoption of their irregular practices. They are not recognized by England, but several American Grand Lodges have extended them recognition beginning during World War II. Discussions of a political or religious nature are permitted within their lodges, but the Grand Lodge studiously avoids making public declarations in favor of any one political issue. The Grand National French Lodge, GLNF, broke away from the GLDF in 1913, is not recognized by the other two major Grand Lodges. It is recognized by England and most American Grand Lodges, and is considered the most regular of the three. It also has close ties to the other Supreme Council, the SCPLF. You see there are two Supreme Councils listed, Supreme Council of France and Supreme Council for France, and we'll delve into that in a little bit. GLNF lodges also confer the degrees in multiple rites, such as Scottish Rite Rectified, Rite Emulation, Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite, French York, and Standard Rite of Scotland. Now, although the most regular and the most recognized, the GLNF is not without its controversy. Grandmaster Francois Stefani was at the center of several scandals from 2019 to 2012, which led to the UGLE withdrawing recognition. Stefani revealed Masonic ritual on television, actively supported several brutal African leaders who are Masons. He refused independent audits of the Grand Lodge finances and had a close relationship with French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Stefani resigned in 2012 and was then expelled. Grand Lodges that had withdrawn their recognition have since restored them. Finally, the GLTSO, or Grand Lodge Traditional and Symbolic Opera, they broke from the GLNF in 1958. Incidentally, the word opera in French, in addition to what we would think of as the definition, can be translated as work. The reason for this split was concern over the strong influence of English Masons on the GLNF and the desire to have fraternal relations with other French lodges. The rectified Scottish Rite is used by 65% of their lodges, and then there are other rites permitted that we've already mentioned, such as the Emulation Rite and Traditional French Rite. So here is our timeline of events in France. As you will see, we have the dates and the significant events over on the left, and I've drawn colored blocks to indicate the timeline for each of these bodies. Some of them, such as the Grand Orient, continues on to the end. Some of them, such as you see Scottish Mother Lodge, English Grand Lodge of France, they only live for a short time. This is to give you a visual picture as I go of the various lodges, Grand Lodges, that have cropped up and went away again over these 300 years. There are two schools of thought about the origins of Masonry in France. After the founding of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, English Masons began to form speculative lodges in France and began to initiate French gentlemen. Some assert that among the Scottish and Irish guards of the Stuart family were Freemasons, who formed the first French lodge at Saint Germain in 1688, the Lodge of Perfect Equality. In either case, in 1728, the English Grand Lodge of France was formed, with Philip, Duke of Wharton, as the first Grand Master. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a papal bull against Masonry, which forbid Catholics from becoming or remaining Masons. But this was in response to and specifically targeted against Italian Catholics, was never enforced in France. In 1743, Louis de Bourbon-Condé, Count of Clermont, was installed as Grand Master. During his reign, he promoted the Écossais, or Scottish Master degrees. These 10 degrees were expanded over the next 60 years to become what we know as the 33 ancient and accepted Scottish Rite degrees. In 1745, Etienne Morin founded the Bordeaux, the Respectable Lodge of the Perfect Elected, the first Scottish Mother Lodge, which conferred the Écossais degrees. These 10 degrees culminated in the Scottish Master degree, later called the Grand Elect Perfect or Perfect Elu. This includes the first 3 degrees of the Blue Lodge, and at some point the Scottish Rite Lodges began to offer their own version of these degrees, which they still use today. In the 1750s, the English Grand Lodge of France became wholly independent and became the Grand Lodge of France. In 1771, a new assembly of Masons declared the Grand Lodge of France to no longer exist, establishing the Grand Orient of France GODF as the new Grand Lodge. In 1773, the Grand Orient was officially constituted, but most lodges remained loyal to the Grand Lodge of France, which didn't go away. During the French Revolution, many lodges went inactive, and the Grand Master of the Grand Orient resigned his position. During this period, the Écossais, or Scottish Master degrees, have become quite popular in France, and the Grand Orient resisted them and banned their conferral within the confines of the city of Paris. In 1799, the Grand Lodge of France was renamed the Scottish Grand Lodge of France. Also in 1799, the Grand Orient reunited with the Grand Lodge, but this union did not last more than a few years. In 1801, in Charleston, South Carolina, the first Supreme Council of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite is formed. The 10 Scottish Master degrees have grown to 32 degrees, culminating in the Master of the Royal Secret. Supreme Council, composed of 9 members who reserved this 33rd and last degree, and Alexander de Grasse Tilly was instrumental in establishing our Mother Supreme Council, returns to France in 1804. Now here's where we actually care about specific dates. In 1804, on October 22nd, shortly after de Grasse Tilly's return, several Scottish Master Lodges, at odds with the Grand Orient, met and established a General Scottish Grand Lodge of the Rite, Ancient and Accepted, REAA. They installed Prince Louis Bonaparte as Grand Master, with de Grasse Tilly as his deputy. On November 27th, Louis's oldest brother, Joseph Bonaparte, becomes the Grand Master of the Grand Orient, with Louis as his deputy. And on December 1st, Louis's other brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, is crowned Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, by Pope Pius VII. Napoleon never became a Mason, although both his brothers were, and were both Grand Masters. Napoleon actually made fun of his brothers and talked about their silly handshakes and their silly aprons. But you can see where the French government is very closely tied to how French Masonry operates. So here we have conflicting information as far as the origins. One source claims in 1799, the Grand Lodge of France, which are the blue lodges that remained after the Grand Orient broke off, renamed themselves the Scottish Grand Lodge. Another source claims that a new Grand Lodge, the General Scottish Grand Lodge of REAA, was formed from a handful of Scottish Master Lodges in 1804. There may well have been 2 Scottish Grand Lodges in France. But an agreement was reached that the Grand Orient will manage the 1st through 18 degrees, while the Scottish Grand Lodge, which is now the Supreme Council of France, SCDF, will manage the 19th through the 33rd. Incidentally, most Supreme Councils throughout the world were made at this time because of the Supreme Council of France. So our brothers in Brazil can thank the Supreme Council of France for their Scottish Rite. In 1813, in England, the ancients and the moderns set aside their differences and formed the Grand Lodge of the United Grand Lodge of England. In 1814, the Grand Master of the Grand Orient declares the office of Grand Master of the Supreme Council to be vacant and removes a number of officers. He makes many demands of the remaining members of the Supreme Council. Most simply resign. Those who remain reject the demands of the Grand Orient. In 1815, the Grand Master of the Grand Orient declares the Supreme Council to be irregular. He then creates the Great Consistory of Rites to take its place. In 1826, the Great Consistory of Rites changes its name to the Grand College of Rites, Supreme Council for France and the French possessions. In 1821, the Supreme Council, after much turmoil, is reestablished. They create the Central Grand Lodge. You see Supreme Council of France in orange, Central Grand Lodge in blue there at the bottom. The Central Grand Lodge oversees the first 3 degrees, while the 4th through 33 degrees are controlled by the Supreme Council. very similar how we do in the United States, where a Scottish Rite is treated as an appendant body, and the Blue Lodges confer the first 3 degrees. In 1834, the Supreme Councils of France, Belgium, Brazil, and Western Europe enter into a treaty of union and alliance. These meetings lead to the Lausanne Conference in 1875. This is important. The treaty affirms that no Supreme Council can be part of another rite, such as a Grand Lodge, without losing their independence and authority. So they're saying, if you are a Supreme Council, you don't fall under a Grand Lodge or a Grand Orient. You must be sovereign, which is basically a swipe at the Grand College of Rites, which is a sub-part of the Grand Orient. In 1848, we have the Second French Revolution, also called the February Revolution, which brought the ideas of secularism, liberty, and hope to the people of France, ideas that began to take hold among French Masons. So remember, at this time, the Catholic Church was the official religion of the state. And despite the papal bull, most Masons in France are still Catholic. But many of them did not want the church or the state to dictate how Masons should behave. As a result of this revolution and the new way of thinking, a handful of lodges formed the National Grand Lodge, which we see down there in yellow, limited to the first 3 degrees, advocating a single rite, and it was never recognized and was dissolved by the government in 1851. So again, you have the government telling you whether you can have a Grand Lodge or not. In 1873, to sidestep the secularism movement, the Supreme Council of France declares that all documents must begin with, "To the glory of the Grand Architect of the Universe, under the name and the auspices of the Supreme Council of France, liberty, equality, fraternity." So the Supreme Council throws down a gauntlet and says, any official document has to reference the Grand Architect. In 1875, the Central Grand Lodge and the Supreme Council adopt the decision of the Lausanne Conference, stating that the Grand Architect of the Universe is the principal creator of the universe. They follow this definition to this day. In 1877, the Grand Orient strikes the reference to the Grand Architect from the rituals, leading the United Grand Lodge of England to sever ties with them. In 1880, 12 lodges formed the Scottish Symbolic Grand Lodge, later renamed the Symbolic Grand Lodge of France. In 1882, Marie d'Erasmus was initiated into the Free Thinkers Lodge, which was then disbanded by the Symbolic Grand Lodge of France. She and Dr. Georges Martin, a French Mason and politician, then founded Le Droit Humain, a Masonic organization dedicated to allowing both women and men to join, also known as co-Masonry. Le Droit Humain was established as an international order in 1893. They are not a grand lodge as we would think of them. They have lodges in various countries, and they offer recognition on their own to almost all the grand lodges throughout the world. And with a handful of exceptions, most grand lodges don't return the favor. In 1894, the Central Grand Lodge breaks away from the Supreme Council, changing its name to the Grand Lodge of France, GLDF. The Grand Lodge controls the Blue Lodges, still working in Scottish Rite ritual and continuing regular French Masonry. In 1896, most of the lodges that belong to the Symbolic Grand Lodge of France joined the GLDF, and the Symbolic Grand Lodge ceases to exist. In 1913, the Independent and Regular National Grand Lodge, GLNIR, was formed. Also in 19, the Symbolic Mixed Grand Lodge, see them there in dark orange, was formed with the goal of co-Masonry and falls apart. The GLNR survives World War I and is renamed the Grand National French Lodge, GLNF, after World War II. So in 1940, Freemasonry is banned by the Vichy French government and the German forces. This is a low point for French Masonry. Many lodges are closed and never open again. In 1944, the Grand College of Rights and the Supreme Council of France enter into a discussion of a merger. But this fails over disputes about the great architect of the universe. One says there is one says we don't have to reference him, and how the great constitutions are applied. In 1945, the Grand Lodge of France is reconstituted after World War II. In 1952, we see down here in the lower right, we see a couple little guys. The Women's Grand Lodge of France, GLFF, was constituted. They came from the lodges of adoption, which were similar to a cross between Eastern Star, Ladies Auxiliary, and actual lodges with men and women as Masons. But by 1959, they abandoned the idea of these rite of adoption lodges and just simply start using Scottish Rite ritual and become regular Masonic, become Scottish Rite lodges. In 1958, the French National Grand Lodge Opera splits from the Grand Lodge and the GLNF. In order to avoid confusion, they are renamed as the Grand Lodge Traditional and Symbolic Opera, GLTSO. In 1964, the Grand Lodge of France signs a Treaty of Fraternal Alliance with the Grand Orient. So pay attention. The Grand Lodge of France signs a treaty with the Grand Orient of France. This forces over 1,000 Masons to leave the Grand Lodge of France and join the Grand National French Lodge because they want nothing to do with the Grand Orient, which doesn't require you to believe in God anymore. All right, 65 to present. In 1965, the Supreme Council is, once again, we have a Supreme Council declared irregular by the Grand Lodge of France. This was the Central Grand Lodge. This was the Grand Lodge that the Supreme Council created to manage the craft degrees. The Grand Lodge of France declares them irregular, and the territory of France is now considered unoccupied as far as Scottish Rite is concerned. Charles Riandy was the sovereign Grand Commander of the Supreme Council. He resigns and is immediately commissioned by the major Supreme Councils in Europe to form a new Supreme Council for France. So now you have the Supreme Council of France, which has been around all this time, the SCDF, and now we have the Supreme Council for France, SCPLF. Both claim they are the rightful Supreme Council. They both claim they date back to 1804. In fact, when you look at both of their websites, they list their history as starting in 1804, even though the SCPLF was not founded until 1965. But they claim to be the original. And the SCPLF strengthens their ties to the Grand National French Lodge, the GLNF. In 1968, 3 lodges of the French National Grand Lodge Opera break off to form the French National Lodge, LNF. See over there on all the way to the right. In 1973, the global, this is right in the middle here, the one that's shorter than the other ones, the Global Mixed Grand Lodge, GLMU, is formed, which is a successor to the Symbolic Mixed Grand Lodge of 60 years earlier, have the same goal of co-masonry. The GLMU adopts its constitution in 1979 and very similar to the Grand Orient in makeup. In 1982, the Mixed Grand Lodge of France, GLMF, breaks away from the GLMU. They allow their lodges to be all male, all female, or mixed. It also allows its lodges to practice any of a half dozen or more rites. In 1994, regular Masons of the GF and GLTSO form the Rectified and Reformed Scottish Rite Grand Lodge of Occitania. This is made up of 3 independent bodies, a Grand Lodge, a Directory of St. Andrew Lodges, and the Great Priory, which is similar to the Knights Templar here in the U.S. In 2001, the regular Grand Lodge of France is formed, following the Grand Lodge and the GLNF rules. And finally, in 2015, members of the French National Lodge, LNF, formed the French National Joint Lodge, LNMF, which allows women Masons. And in 2018, they both merged to become the United French National Lodge, LNFU. So what we see in reviewing 300 years of Masonry in a single country is a landscape that is constantly changing. New Grand Lodges formed, disbanded, sometimes at the whim of a single Grand Master, sometimes by the lodges or by the individual Masons, and sometimes Masons vote with their feet and move en masse to another Grand Lodge. It appears they are constantly asking the question, what is Masonry? And finding different answers to that question. Compare this to Masonry in the United States, where once a Grand Lodge is formed, its structure changes little throughout 200 years. Is France an example of a chaotic confusion where nothing is ever good enough? Or is it a vibrant, thriving organization that is constantly re-examining itself? Is our American system stable because it got it right the first time and is needed no course corrections? Or are we a stagnant pond so resistant to change that we do nothing when the opportunity for improving presents itself? A constant complaint among Masons is that we can't keep our members, that we are not offering what the new or even the older members want, and thus they leave us. Are we so resistant to change that we are unable to fix that which is wrong or on the wrong track just to preserve our fraternity? Each of you should ask yourself these questions. Thank you.
Good job, Chris.
Okay. Chris, thank you so much for that program. Very interesting. Any brothers have any questions for Chris?
Yeah, well, I do. Actually, some of the questions that you raised at the end are really, really good ones. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts, because frankly, as I was looking at your last slide where you had the bars for each of the individual Grand Lodges, right? And I was trying quick to count how many they were and think about the problems that would be for them connecting with each other.
Right.
Recognizing each other, let alone our problems and recognizing them from outside. I guess, did you find any evidence or did you see anything in there which you said, hey, that looks like something we've had here in the United States? For example, I think, we have a Grand Lodge per state. We also have appendant bodies like the Shrine. And it makes big news here when state Grand Lodges refuse to recognize a Shrine, as happened relatively recently, right? I mean, that's like, oh my God, this just happened.
Right.
Here you've got them having, hey, I don't agree with you, I'm just going to form a new Grand Lodge. Bam.
Right.
So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I haven't really compared it a lot to what we have. You bring up a point about the Shrine, but of course, what makes us here so different, and this is where it's a mental shift when you start looking at other countries, because most of us here in America are so used to what we have as Masonry, we think that's Masonry, period. We're all York Rite Masons. We have appendant bodies here. You have to stay in the Blue Lodge if you're going to join anything else. So it's a different mindset. It's like, well, you're in the Blue Lodge for a while, and then you join the Scottish Rite or the Royal Arch at some point, maybe both, maybe the Shrine, if that was your goal. But yeah, but you're still dependent on the Blue Lodge. You still have to maintain your membership in the Blue Lodge, and too many of us get involved, especially in the Shrine, and forget we're in the Blue Lodge altogether other than writing a check once a year. So it is a different mindset. All of these bodies I mentioned, there's a few exceptions with the Supreme Councils where they set up a Grand Lodge for the craft degrees, but most of them, their Grand Lodge is their Grand Lodge. I mean, just because they have Scottish Rite ritual, you're in the same body for everything. So it is a little bit different how we do stuff. Like you bring up the Shrine, and that's always been a case where it's everything I've read, it's one potentate goes afoul of the law, the Grand Lodge suspends him, and the shrine says, never mind that, you're still our potentate, you're still in the shrine. And then the Grand Lodge has to say, no, you must maintain your Blue Lodge membership to be in this other appended body. And then they get into a pissing contest. And it's unfortunate that they let it get to that point, but then it hurts all of them. But again, that's a relation between between the Grand Lodge and an appended body. In France, it's a whole different world because all of them are, it's like everything's wrapped up in one. They do have a few supreme councils that have their appended degrees in a sense, like ours are, but most of them, they may offer all the degrees, but you're in from the Blue Lodge on up. It's still one body recognizing another body. So they can't really affect each other in that way of saying, you know, we're going to kick you out because you did this in the Blue Lodge. You know what I mean? So it's not quite the same. But I don't see where there are that many similarities. I haven't really thought of cases where we've done this. Typically, we don't break off. The only thing I can think of where we're similar to what France did is West Virginia breaking away from Virginia during the Civil War, because the counties in Virginia that didn't want to secede voted to stay in the North, stay in the Union and form their own state. Well, that affected the Grand Lodge immediately, because we have about 100 lodges in West Virginia that were Virginia lodges right up until the Civil War. And I don't know when the Grand Lodge of West Virginia was formed. I think I'm going to do a paper on that, is research how that came about. But it was very quickly after West Virginia became a state. The lodges in West Virginia said, yeah, we're no longer part of the Grand Lodge of Virginia. We're a separate state. We can't be part of that Grand Lodge either. And we lost about 100 lodges overnight. So that's the closest example I can think of to what France goes through. But it was more of a geographical one. So
it doesn't
Perfect.
seem like that they really have any. I'm not quite sure I understand where they fit together.
there's that.
They're moving.
The French,
Yeah.
they're all separate bodies. I mean, it's basically like Virginia to North Carolina to Maryland to Delaware. We're all separate and we all recognize each other. But if Tennessee suddenly decides we're not going to allow gay Masons, which they decided, we break. I don't know if we did, but other states broke off ties with Tennessee over that one issue. So it's kind of like, think of it like that. But the difference is we're geographical. All of the lodges in Virginia, in the Grand Lodge of Virginia, are in the state of Virginia. This would be a case of kind of like Prince Hall, but they're totally separate from us. I mean, I did not see anything about jurisdiction in anything that I read, and I'd have to dig deeper to figure it out. I basically considered each of these Grand Lodges as having sovereignty over the whole country of France. So basically, they all 20-some overlap each other all the time. So you can live in one state, one city in France, and go to one body here, and go down the street and go to another body that's in a different Grand Lodge. So I guess that's how it works. It would be a lot of work to figure out individually how all the lodges fall in place, but I assume every major city is going to have a lodge from each of these grand bodies in it. I know Paris does. Paris probably has every single one represented. If you looked at Paris, you'd probably find at least 2 or 3 lodges for each grand body. So they're next door to each other, and they don't interact. They can't visit. Most of them can't visit each other, especially the women. The co-masonry lodges aren't going to be allowed to visit anyone except the Grand Orient. And like I said, the GLNF is not recognized by the other 2 big Grand Lodges in there. And some of these may well be small. I mean, I haven't looked, but you might have some of these that only exist in like Paris and maybe nearby, and there may be parts of France that don't even have, the GLFF or some of these smaller ones. They may not even exist there. So.
Yeah, may I have a question?
Yes, please, Rubens. Hey, how you doing?
Hi. Congratulations for this work, Chris, because this is something Herculean. Because the number of Grand Lodges working there, it's really huge.
Yeah.
So it's not different from some other parts, like in Brazil, we have this kind of thing, some states. But most part of them, I guess, work in the first 3 degrees, except maybe the Supreme Councils and I'm not sure about this rectified and reformed Scottish Rite Grand Lodge. You said, I think this is the only one, the rectified one is the only one operating like in a region because it has this Occitania denomination, the name, because it's the very southwestern part of France. I'm not sure, just guessing. But my question is, just the only body recognized by U.S. Grand Lodge is the National French Grand Lodge, I guess. Could you? Yes, probably this. I don't know. Sorry. And for the Supreme Council, I guess there was something happened just this year because of recognition that was dropped off. The recognition of Supreme Council because of accepting Master Masons from a not recognized one. Not sure about it, but there is something like this. But I guess from the point of view for the 3 first degrees as the Grand Lodges in US, as you know, you operate very easily through the Conference of Grandmaster. This is awesome. You have there working together, and also. Certainly, we have the Prince Hall affiliated also, but it's very united in USA. But I guess the recognition is mainly or only the National French Grand Lodge. Is this correct?
Okay, I have records of which Grand Lodges recognize each other. I'm only about 10% of the way through mapping them out. I started mapping them all out, and it's very involved because everyone's got at least 185 other Grand Lodges. So I don't have complete records. I could probably look that up if I had time. But I believe the GLNF, as I found in the paper, the GLNF is the one that's most recognized by American Grand Lodges. But everybody has, and there's all kinds of variety. I hadn't read about the Supreme Council. I actually wrote this paper a year ago. So I haven't made an effort to update it. I kind of set it aside and was working on other things. So I don't know what's current in the Supreme Council. I'm sure if I go research it, there may be 3 new Grand Lodges since I wrote this a year ago. I don't know. The only thing I really changed was I wrote the conclusion basically this week because I didn't like the conclusion I had, so I wrote a new one. So that's fairly new, Mark. I came up with this idea the other day. I need to have something to wrap it up with because I was sort of like, okay, now what? So I'm glad y'all like that. Sometimes inspiration comes to you under pressure. And Joe Martinez, you brought up a valid point. I did briefly mention our Prince Hall duality at the beginning. I wasn't going to dive into that, but yes, there are Prince Hall Grand Lodges in about 35 states. We are the only country in the world that has a schism like that, and that's a whole nother discussion about Prince Hall, but in a nutshell, they broke off right around the time of the Revolutionary War when we were creating our Grand Lodges. And basically, there were regular black Masons in Massachusetts under England. And we stopped talking to everybody during the war. When the war's over, it's like, okay, well, we'll make friends with England again. And they're like, okay, we'll make friends with you. And then these black Masons were like, okay, make friends with us. We're like, who? So, yeah, so Prince Hall basically, it led to, I'm very, very, very oversimplifying, but basically they grew up alongside us. And it's only now at the end of the 20th century we finally started recognizing the Prince Hall. Virginia recognized them, I think, 90 or 95, something like that. And most states have recognized the Prince Hall counterpart. But they're a whole separate discussion. And really, I would say the Prince Hall are very, very similar to the mainstream or state Grand Lodges that we are. And of course, Louisiana is another good example. I've read papers about Louisiana. There is a Supreme Council in France with about 12 lodges, and they confer the Scottish Rite ritual. They are not recognized. They're considered irregular by the Southern Jurisdiction Supreme Council that most of us belong to. But they're a whole nother story in themselves, yes. So you have some else to add, Joe?
I do, yeah. Great conclusion at the end, too. And to answer Brother Ruben's question, if you go to the, for those of you that have the Amity app, it tells you if you go to another country which lodges are recognized by your Grand Lodge, and it's the GLNF that Virginia Masons could go to
Okay.
if you're ever in Paris. But back to the Louisiana thing. There are lodges in Louisiana that we recognize. We recognize the Grand Lodge of Louisiana that
Right.
do confer the Scottish craft first three
Yes.
degrees. You also see that there's a lodge in DC that does that as well. There's a lodge in New York. So for those of you that have never seen the first 3 degrees, the EcoSay first 3 degrees, they're super different and they're very, very cool. So I definitely recommend you go check those out because they're very different than our Preston Webb degrees.
Yes. I'm sure everyone here is a member of the group. So, if I put it there, you'll know about it. But I want to make stuff available to you all. I want to make the group a jumping off point for this kind of stuff. And if you know of something, please post it. And if we can make that a jumping off point to go, and if maybe we put together a list of Facebook groups people would be interested in, we can make that a permanent thing. I'll figure out a way to make that available. But I really want to do more with our Facebook group. I want to make it, because it's centered around an actual lodge. There's a lot of online bodies that are research related or Masonic related, and they're great. And I belong to a lot of them on Facebook, but we actually are centered around an actual lodge, and I want us to do more with it than what we're currently. You may think this is great what we're doing, but I'm always want to do more. I'm always looking for ways to push the envelope and offer more to y'all. And if it can be like a clearinghouse for anything online stuff I see that's neat, I want to list it. And if you see stuff that's neat, I'd like you to list it, and then other people can go and join, and we can get people, we can be a growing thing, and people will constantly check in with us, and we could become a stopping point for people looking for Masonic research. I want to see more discussion on our group of more legitimate topics. I mean, if I could crack a whip and get y'all to do what I want more of y'all to comment on these weekly papers, because it's nice that people are reading them. I'm sure some of you are talking amongst yourselves about them, but if we could get people to have sort of more discussions about the papers after you read them. I also thought maybe we might start having a Zoom meeting, if y'all are interested. After I publish a paper, maybe have a Zoom meeting the next day to discuss the paper. Because what we do in the research lodge is we present a paper and then have discussion. So maybe we can kind of breathe more life into these papers and then have a Zoom meeting like the next day and discuss that paper that was published that week. Is that something you all would be interested in? Anybody else got any questions or anything else they want to bring up?
No, good job, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Anybody? All right, guys, thank you all very much for attending. We had a high water mark of 15, so that's a record for us. I will probably keep doing this every Saturday at 10, because that seems to work. If people have suggestions, but I think I might try to make that a regular thing at this time, and that may make it easier for our European brothers to attend. So I'll start haranguing them, see if I get them to tune in, because it's afternoon there. If I have a meeting at 7 o'clock at night, that's only really convenient for people on the East Coast, maybe some people on the West Coast, but I really want to, we have guys all over the world on this group, and I want to try and get them involved, so a Saturday morning might work better for them too. Everybody like and subscribe. No. Well, I'm going to have to edit this when I put it on YouTube, so I'll tell everybody to like them. If you haven't been to my YouTube page, please go. I'm going to put another video on there. I need to get 100 subscribers so I can have a vanity URL. So please go subscribe to my YouTube page.